Hello and welcome to Red Spin Sports. We're joined today by a special guest to discuss a topic that's essential for any sports fan to understand, but more importantly, for non-sports fans who perhaps don't realize the extent to which U.S. cultural soft power is concentrated within sports, and more particularly, what can only be described as a sports media industrial complex. Michael Serazio is an associate professor in the Department of Communications at Boston College. His research and teaching focuses on media production, advertising, popular culture, political communication, and new media. His latest book is The Power of Sports, Media and Spectacle in American Culture from NYU Press. It's a behind-the-scenes investigation that draws upon dozens of interviews with leaders and professionals in the media business. Power of Sports provocatively analyzes how sports culture explains and reflects contemporary American life, from journalism to politics to commercialism to gender. A native San Diegan, Mike enjoys rooting, often frustratingly, for the Padres and perhaps still the Chargers. I guess we can talk about that. And above all, spending time with his wife and daughter. And I'll link to his website below. So anyways, just welcome to the show, Professor Serazio, and just anything you want to kind of say to kick it off, I'd love to hear. And thanks for joining us here today.
Thank you very much for the invite and very kind opportunity to talk about the book. It does feel like certainly a crazy moment in the history of the world, and I think often about how sports maps onto that as we desire some sense of normalcy, and whether or not sports can provide that is an interesting question to go forward. But yeah, thank you so much for having me on Red Spin. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for coming. So as we start off, I guess we'll just start off with just kind of the COVID-19 pandemic, kind of how life has changed for all of us really, but you particularly. So just kind of on a personal level, kind of how did it affect you as being at Boston College in terms of faculty, students, family, and in terms of the shutdown? I mean, I'm in K-12 education myself, and there's a lot of issues you can kind of dive into, but I was just kind of curious from your perspective, sort of how that's gone and it's still going, I guess, right now.
Yeah. Well, I think there's no question that for everybody right now, this has been about as taxing a year as one can remember collectively, certainly. I think first thing you guys got to stipulate gratitude for having health in a time where there's, massive amounts of sickness and death, and also gratitude just in terms of being at to this point, fingers crossed, to still have employment at a time where there's widespread layoffs and cutbacks and things like that. And certainly colleges, if we wanted to have a whole separate podcast discussion about colleges and their business model and the challenges around that, that's a whole other conversation. But anyway, stipulating those two sort of levels of gratitude, it's been challenging. I mean, we sent the students home from BC in March, shifted over to online learning, and despite I think our best efforts, it's just it's an approximation of the real thing. And in part of my research, a big part of my research is about sports, but broadly it's about media and technology and our relationships to those things. And I think I've often felt slightly skeptical as opposed to slightly optimistic when it comes to how much technology is in our lives. And so the notion that we had to shift everything over to Zoom when we teach and when we relate to old friends makes me more sad than it does excited. So it's been a taxing time, but I'm certainly hopeful that things can get better.
Right. Yeah. So on a personal anecdote, just to build on what you said real quick. I mean, I've worked in last 5 years here in Jersey City within the public school system, and been at a high school that's one of the most gifted and talented, highest ranked schools here in the state, in New Jersey. But then more recently, I've been at one of the most challenged middle schools in terms of just economic, just perpetual sort of normalized misery a lot of kids have to deal with. In all honesty, the shift to online learning was just, a disaster in a lot of ways. Kids were just, we had kids going through the McDonald's parking lot, to try to get the Wi-Fi to turn something in. And And I hate to say to this point, some are trying really hard, and you're just kind of like, God, I don't even really care that much, at that point. But then you have others that are just completely off the map, and still we don't know, kind of where they've gone with the cost of living in an area around New York City. If they, who knows, they've just gone off the map. But it's always been something that interesting to me, the media depictions of sport. And reading your book was just something that just opened my eyes in terms of just more specific detail, and really just kind of helped me contextualize, my own personal experience from, kind of having a duality of like being in worlds where around a lot of privilege, and then, but in working and my own experience playing football and coaching inner city high school football, it's just, it can really, when you have that duality, which is something lacking a lot of times in our society because people are we're so stratified by class, particularly. It really kind of gets you thinking. And I think this is a perfect topic to sort of like, help us understand that. And so let's just go ahead and dive into it. I mean, first of all, I know you have a background in journalism, and that kind of work sort of coincided with your academic work. But I want to get into the book, first of all. And I thought it was really interesting. The first page, you used the word inexplicable stood out to me when describing fanhood. So, and I'll read the quote. It was like, whenever I was back in town, referring to San Diego, I felt an inexplicable urge to pick up a cap or a shirt with a lightning bolt, like Charger logo on it. And I kind of related to me because I kind of feel that inexplicable urge too. And I was wondering maybe if you could kind of elaborate as to like why you chose the adjective inexplicable to kind of describe that sort of this compulsive maybe desire we have to consume, and how that relates to the totemic allegiance stuff that you write about, or any other way you want to kind of go with that.
And the other term you use, compulsive, I think is in effect is also a good analogous term. I mean, there's something funny about our relationships with our favorite teams and the symbols that represent them, that we have this, as I wrote in the book, kind of inexplicable attachment to. And I think that was kind of, I mean, it's, as you mentioned, it sort of is one of the sort of lead-in parts to the book, but I think that was also the curiosity that I had that sort of was the thread that I was pulling at in the book. It's like, why do fans, and I include myself in this as a San Diego fan, why is it that we, we're drawn to spend money on our favorite team gear? And I think the thing that because it is sort of an irrational attachment, right? It's not exactly clear why, rationally we would gravitate toward, most of the time, symbols that represent great failure, right? I mean, like, I'm a San Diego fan, and God knows that the Padres and Chargers have had a dismal existence in professional sports. And why would I rush out to spend money on something that represents that failure? And so, for me, the explanation that I kind of pull at throughout the whole book is that it's fundamentally related to identity and community, which are two things that people, I think, are in desperate need of in the modern world. And sports becomes the thing that fills in those needs that people have. And so, even though it is kind of irrational, it is kind of inexplicable, it does make sense if you think people are trying to fulfill those social and relational needs, basically.
Right. So you mentioned like the experience you had too of like attending the last ever home San Diego Chargers game, and I kind of wanted to tie this to the way in which the NFL, particularly, I mean, other leagues do it, but the NFL, and using Roger Goodell kind of as like an economic hitman of sorts, to go around and hold these sort of cities that love their teams, that have this sort of allegiance that's, as we both kind of described. I'm from Jacksonville and was a young kid when we got the Jaguars, and while we had initial success and in 2017 made it the AFC Championship game, I mean, it's been, other than those kind of spurts, it's been mostly tough sledding, but still there's that same sort of attachment. So you described that final game and like kind of like the insult being added to injury and kind of like the normality of everything, while the ominous sort of like feeling of knowing this is all about the end. And I want to get into the stadium stuff. So maybe if we could like maybe tie that experience as like a segue to talking about like the NFL's the San Diego example of their inability to get a stadium built. Is it I think in some ways it's sort of a contradictory feeling you probably get a feel. I mean, even though very, very well, the irrationality of fanhood, the NFL obviously exploits these emotional ties we have, and as a result is able to coerce like our city and county governments to support these terrible stadium deals that take money from public education, from all sorts of priorities that need to be prioritized. So should we look at the San Diego example as one that's as tough as it is, I guess, for Chargers fans to kind of see as a success in some ways, perhaps, in the sense that while they lost the team, they didn't succumb to the kind of like economic hitman tactics of like Roger Goodell. And I was just kind of wondering, just wherever you wanted to go in terms of your own experience, and then kind of bringing it to the larger macro level issue with the NFL, kind of how you see that in terms of what went down in San Diego.
Yeah. I think what you described is a sense of ambivalence that is precisely the feeling that I had as I watched the case study of the San Diego Chargers play out. So on one hand, as I just described a second ago, this was an institution, this was an entity that was deeply embedded in my own identity. It was embedded in the civic identity of my hometown. It was embedded in the communal relations, both in my own family and the sort of larger kinship of your fellow citizens in the city. So it meant something deep in a tribal way. And that meant it had such value, and that meant that it could be exploited by the NFL, by certainly the owner of the Chargers, Dean Spanos, attempted to exploit that in getting a stadium deal done. And so if you put on one side all of these really powerful, true, real emotions in our attachment to sport, and you put on the other side the sort of sober financial calculations, and this is where I'm not an economist by any means, but my reading of the economic literature on sports stadia and big mega events like the Olympics and the World Cup is that they are a complete and total waste of money, right? Like, I mean, they have tremendous social value, tremendous cultural value, but if you just want to talk about does this make financial sense, right? The answer is no. And so because all sports leagues operate as cartels, they are able to play cities off each other. And so this is what happened in San Diego, more or less, is that the ownership tried to get a taxpayer-funded stadium deal done here. People of San Diego said, go fly a kite. And so Dean Spanos sort of picked up the team and went home, basically. And so this was something that was, deeply troubling, deeply problematic in terms of, people feeling betrayed. But at the same time, they did the right thing. I say that as someone who's really sad that the Chargers left town, but I was also really proud of my hometown for saying no to the cartel and, as you put it, the economic hitman embodied in Roger Goodell in the league. And so those are competing things, and they leave me with tremendous ambivalence. I think San Diego is the anomaly. We could see, with obviously post-COVID, everything comes with a caveat of not knowing what's going to happen next. And I don't know whether the logic of stadium financing and the logic of economics with the impending recession will change the dynamics of pressure in that regard. But I think San Diego will stand as more of the anomaly as opposed to the bellwether for going forward. I still think cities are going to pony up and spend gobs of taxpayer money on that sort of thing, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, you already see, Dan Snyder, for instance, with Washington being in the news so much, and I just did a whole appearance on that, and it's just, that's a whole nother thing. But Dan Snyder, in the midst of a pandemic, it's all this going on, and the terrible just culture of office sexual harassment there is still pushing this stadium deal. My good friend and mentor really kind of getting involved in this. Max Blumenthal is from Washington, D.C., and he lives in Southeast D.C., Ward 8. And it's just just all sorts of needs that aren't being met. All basically the police just being financed as a way for to substitute for there being really the kind of community programs, the job programs, the kind of things that there need to be to really uplift the community that's been ravaged by gentrification and on an epic scale in the nation's capital. And yet Dan Snyder, I think some of his calculation, at least in the name change, well, certainly from corporate sponsor pressure, is the idea that by changing the name, he can get a DC, get the team back in DC, which people don't know that the city government wasn't going to talk stadium deal or whatever, while the name still remained what it was. So there's, that's still a thing. And just, you think of like just the profound needs and where the coming recession you just mentioned, and just the hubris and arrogance, just the fact that NFL owners are still going to push ahead with this. And you write in the book, in an era of cultural fragmentation, political polarization, and the relentless distraction that comes with living amidst media abundance, sports represents one of the last institutions of unifying mass ritual, bringing together enormous audiences, focused on the present live moment, keyword being live, I say. In fact, it retains a timeless totemic cultural power long ago revealed to be at the core of religious worship, but given a new import in the DVR and smartphone age. I was wondering if you could elaborate kind of on that passage there and kind of like its significance in our day and age today.
Sure, absolutely. So a few things going on there. One is refers to this particular moment we're living in, right? We are living in a moment of extraordinary cultural fragmentation, right? So in that sense, the number of entertainment forms and sort of diversions and pop culture that unites us is becoming smaller and smaller niches. So if you think back on previous eras of, say, television, right, which is sort of main driver for sports, in the late 1970s, early 1980s, 90% of the whole country was watching one of three channels every night. That's radically different nowadays in terms of how people's attention is scattered across, hundreds of cable channels, millions of websites, and sort of social media outlets. So there's a way in which our attention is becoming more scattered across these different cultural phenomenon. Obviously, the sort of moment of political division seems to be more and more divided with each passing year. So you got those things happening. Now, for me, one of the interesting things is that sports, unlike other forms of entertainment, still retain a centralizing force, right? They still bring together large audiences, or they obviously did before the pandemic hit. And so there's something powerful in that. And so I use the phrase totemic to sort of understand also what we were talking about earlier when we were talking about our attachment to team logos and team symbols. And the idea there is not is one that I borrow from a famous sociologist by the name of Emil Durkheim, who wrote 100 years ago, and he didn't write about sports, he wrote about religion because he found religion to be really fascinating. He basically thought that when people within a religion worshipped some divine form, what those people were actually worshiping was the experience of community. So for Durkheim, he would look at something like Christianity, and he would look at the worship of the cross and the crucifix and Jesus Christ, and he would say, one of the things that does is that provides a reason for Christians to have solidarity. And that's truly what the point of religion is. And so I take that in the same way for sports, in that sports, for me, the point of sports is to provide us with symbols that unify us, especially at a moment in time where there is a real lack of unity and a real sense of division. And so that's kind of where I draw out the analogy in the book. I think the best way to understand sports is to look at it through the lens of religion.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think it's, in a lot of ways, as we see church attendance kind of decline in recent years in the West, particularly in Europe, and then, now in the US, we have sort of a crisis of belonging to something, right? And people are just sort of feel like they're kind of floating around everywhere without a sense of like a transcendent purpose. It reminds me kind of like of Erich Fromm's Escape from Freedom, while that, dealt with the context of the Nazis and the horrors of all that, the idea of identity and kind of what, especially for like, kind of right-wing, sort of nationalistic, fascist type, identity, where it's rooted in. And it's really rooted in an anxiety over your own, it's a lot of times masculinity, identity being, stripped away, living in a modern context where you're not like, living off the land and kind of doing, at least in the American context, our kind of settler colonial ancestors, and how that still kind of manifests itself. So I think that the Durkheim bringing that in and framing it through the lens of religion is key, because you're right. It's no more Walter Cronkite and everyone just goes to working. What does it even mean if someone asks you, oh, did you watch the news last night? people are going to look at you crazy, right? Like, what do you mean the news, right? It's so it's just that simple fact alone just sort of just tells you all you need to know, and that it's just only going to continue to fragment. But so many on the left, I feel like maybe just don't maybe get that, in the sense of it's not about whether it's good or bad, or saying you should like sports or not like sports, but they're just the real material like power that's concentrated there, and how that functions sort of in terms of projections of soft power, cultural power within, I would say, this age of monopoly capitalism in which we live in. But anyways, to go on, you say you write that the book is about how sports, explain and reflect life in contemporary American culture, our spiritual experience, technological disruption, commercial greed, economic disparity, military hawkishness, and manhood ideals. If we hold up a mirror to sports, we see the realities of the nation staring back at us, despite what those myths of escapism might like to suggest. And, sports, obviously, it's a lot of times the ultimate escapism. So if you could just kind of elaborate sort of on kind of, or sports fanhood, that is, at least, on sort of what you were getting at there with that passage.
Yeah, of course. I mean, there's a powerful and understandable attraction to thinking about sports as purely escapism, purely fun, purely the thing that at the end of a hard day of work, that you just want to sort of turn it on and disappear into this beautiful cultural practice. And I get that, and I feel it as well. I mean, I find there is something really wonderfully Zen-like in the experience of either watching or playing sports, if you're truly deeply immersed in it. There's a psychological concept known as flow, which is where you're sort of deeply in the moment of the thing that you're doing. And I think sports provides that. And I think that provides that escapism. That being said, I think that the notion that sports do not also reflect all of the problems and all of the trends in the world outside of sports is naive. And I think it's deliberately naive in some cases, depending on the political situation, certainly most prominently in the last 5 years or so, with the Black Lives Matter movement and the politics of that, and the politics of Colin Kaepernick's protest and others. There's a pushback against sports that Kaepernick and others who support these causes should not be doing this because it's interrupting the escape. It's making what should be entertainment. And sports. The argument, misguidedly, is that sports is the place where we should be able to get away from issues of racial injustice. But that's naive. That's preposterous. That's sports is the thing that in this book that I try to explore how it can tell us so much about so many of the things that we want to leave off the field of play. And it's everything from economic inequality to more or less 20 years of endless warfare, to changing dimensions of gender, and as I said before, the Black Lives Matter movement as well. So I understand the impulse to want to see sports as an escape, but it is I think it's fundamentally misguided, because you can't escape such things.
Just to build on what you said, I mean, I'm kind of a bad habit of getting sidetracked, but there's so many ways these conversations can sort of take you. And it's just like, you look at the composition, the NFL, the football, basketball, baseball, my main background. I don't want to, sometimes I feel like I need to focus more on some other sports to make sure I'm kind of covering everything. But nonetheless, it's just sort of, we all kind of lean on our kind of framework and familiarity. But you look at, league that's 70%, Black, and the notion that the labor on the field, it's the idea that they're privileged to be out there having the right to entertain us. And there's a number of things. It harkens back to the idea of even that culture of thinking that, this is apolitical escapism. I would argue a lot of ways is tied to the idea of even the impulse people felt in minstrel shows and stuff. The idea that these people are to be my entertainment. They're nothing more. The Laura Ingraham shut up and dribble stuff really kind of just encapsulates that perfectly. And the anxiety you see, and sort of the ironically apolitical fan, and like their just angst expressed at like Colin Kaepernick and all these threats, which ended up kind of not being true when you look at the data in terms of like actual the Super Bowl rating this last year was still in the top 10. So all these people that constantly come at me like, oh, I'm never going to watch sports again, go F off, blah, blah, blah. You trying to bring politics into sports. All right, say what you want, but you're probably turning that thing on, but whether you want to tell your friends or not. But it really is it's part of that dehumanization, and I even want to take it back to slavery. The idea of like the dehumanization of Black kind of masculinity as being something scary and threatening, and we'll get to that in a minute. But the kind of continue to. What was the other thing I wanted to get on? I mean, you look at that, what Kaepernick did, and like. There was, an era in the late 60s with like Muhammad Ali, 1967, and then Tommy Smith and John Carlos. Muhammad Ali denying the draft and saying that, no Viet Cong ever called me the N-word, or Tommy Smith, John Carlos, the Black Power Solidarity Fist. But that was pre-social media, right? And so with Kaepernick and also with Craig Hodges, the guy you see in the autograph photo back there behind me that was blackballed, from the league, really. He tried even so bad his last year, which was the second Chicago Bulls title year, to kind of shut up and dribble, so to speak, because he knew that was a contract year, but he couldn't. And ultimately, the Rodney King stuff was going on, and he just couldn't understand how people like Jordan and Pippen and Horace Grant, his teammates, just were like, whatever. And ultimately, it got down to he realized that, they fundamentally it wasn't them as individuals necessarily, but they just didn't understand their history. And that's why it's so important to kind of, I guess, sort of try to reclaim that and to take and really to fight these battles over curriculum and who has the power to define history and meaning and whatnot. Because he was on an island. He didn't have like the movement backing from like Black Lives Matter and others that have supported Kaepernick, in the midst of all the attacks. And as a result, he was kind of left out on an island. But anyways, there's a lot of ways you can go with that, with fanhood question. I mean, it's I could talk about that all day, but I mean, the whole idea, the irony too, the flyovers that go on, right? And maybe let's just ask you about that now. I mean, just in the sense of the supposedly, apolitical nature of the flyovers that go on before games, the soldier family reunions that happen that are just supposed to be these emotional moments. And I still go to NFL games with my dad when I visit back home and stuff. And I sit there and I find myself feeling like I'm a stranger, like, and I mean, it's like, what was familiar, because these people are just in this like trance-like state, seeing this. And it's like, there's not for a second. In fact, even if you brought it up, the question of, well, why are they over? Why were they deployed to Afghanistan or Iraq to begin with? Or at Yankee Stadium, they'll bring out and just unironically just say, so-and-so veteran every single seventh inning stretch since 9/11, Operation Iraqi Freedom, Operation Enduring Freedom. And people are just like, going nuts, and there's no analysis of that. So where does that whole inability to look at that as being inherently political come from, you think? I mean, you look at the advertising, you've studied a lot, and all the way in which the U.S. military, Marines and Army, inundate the NBA games, NFL games with like just the trips, the way the NFL uses these trips to Israel, for instance, that give a very select image. It's, not going to show them anything about Palestinians or anything about that at all. Bob Kraft, particularly. We have an episode coming out on that. But where does that come from? The idea that so many people are able to think that militarism dressed up as just patriotism is being apolitical. I mean,
yeah, I mean, it's so there's a long-standing reality of sports and sort of militarism being intertwined. Mm-hmm. I mean, this, it goes back, thousands of years even to sort of the sort of era of Greek activity in sports. But I think that the reason why it has ramped up in the last 2 decades is in many ways because the outcomes of American military engagement abroad, and here we're talking about specifically Afghanistan and Iraq, did not yield clear, much less unambiguously successful results in terms of what the U.S. was trying to do in those foreign conflicts. And I think what sports offered American military culture was a space to sanitize and whitewash to some degree how we understood what was going on in those theaters of battle. And certainly that's been true with regard to the financing of some of these patriotic displays, which I think a lot of people for many years assumed it was just the leagues and the teams doing this for free. And it turned out that until around 5 years ago, John McCain and another senator, I think it was the other senator from Arizona, exposed, I think it was Jeff Flake actually. I think they were the few that sort of exposed the millions of dollars of Pentagon financing that go toward these sort of displays of, thanking troops, welcoming people home, welcoming soldiers home on the Jumbotron screen. And I think, there's something entirely understandable about, the incredible emotional rush of seeing, a soldier brought home from overseas. And it allows us to avoid asking the question, was it really necessary to have, as a civilian nation, sent that soldier over in the first place? Right. And so I think that becomes the way in which the leagues have used, the leagues and arguably, sort of Defense Department as a whole has used individual heroes as a way of hiding questions and criticisms about, military policy decisions that are made. Right. And all of this ties back into the fact that the U.S. spends an extraordinary amount on defense relative to other nations. It's around $700 billion per year. Some people might put it as high as $1 trillion, but it really in terms of federal spending, it's a huge share of the budget.
So it's close to 60% of the overall budget. I mean, when you really look at that, 60 cents of every dollar we pay in taxes essentially goes to a Pentagon that, so badly failed its first audit it ever had that I think they just ended it basically. So it's really difficult with military contractors and all to really kind of ascertain the kind of accurate figure there. But to get it back to your book, because I want to, I keep the focus on, kind of back here, but you evidently, interviewed former NBA commissioner David Stern, who had a critical role in really developing the NBA and bringing it in terms of its media prominence to where it is today, and marketing the rise of Magic, Bird, Jordan, that whole era that coming off of an era in the 70s when it was a very dim, landscape for basketball, and it was tied into race tied into that, the idea of, they wanted marketable, apolitical players. They didn't want Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's and Oscar Robertsons and guys that were troublemakers that weren't, they weren't going to be commercially viable as they looked, fitting within that whole Reagan, Ayn Randian sort of ethos of individualism. But he writes that Stern, I guess, told you in the book, it's a natural flowing dynamic. You build a building where 18 to 20,000 perfect strangers come together for the communal purpose of rooting the home team on to victory, where people who sometimes don't even know each other are high-fiving a spectacular shot or winning performance. As life gets more impersonal, we retreat into our homes, which is particularly ironic now, right? And we order our food, we get our EKG, we buy our cars. Now we have a Carvana too. So we do a tremendous amount from the comfort of our smart devices in a chair at home. The last place that people are likely to gather are going to be houses of worship and houses of sports worship, no doubt about it. And I'm wondering we've talked about this a little bit already, or a good bit actually, but in the context of the pandemic now, I remember I went to one of the last New York NBA games before it shut down. And it was actually, I think, when Rudy Gobert probably contracted COVID in Madison Square Garden in March. And I was just reflecting on that and just the experience there and that gathering, and just kind of wondering, we don't know, we know some treatments are in the works, we know some vaccines are in the works, but we don't, who knows? I mean, they've been looking for HIV vaccines for how long now? And, we're still, so anyways, we're hopeful, but we'll see what happens. But building on what Stern said, what is it from your research and I guess from advertisers' perspectives and marketers that understand this acutely, that communal experience is something that is so badly needed, and that they understand that it's lacking in this, modern world of cultural fragmentation, that to kind of describe that. So does the dynamic that Stern describes, is that going to be something that, you fear, I mean, is it something you even fear it won't come back? Or is it like a natural process where people maybe have to get over that, you know, and learn for us to evolve as a society? I'm just kind of wondering what you think in terms of like whether or not like things will change going forward, whatever the new normal ends up being, and if that's a good thing or a bad thing in general. And can it be reconciled, this desire to have this sort of communal experience with all the kind of negative things that sort of come with it too, that we've already talked about? Is there a way that this can be reconciled, do you feel like?
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the odd things with the pandemic that I think I've come to realize was we took for granted, certainly I did, but I think collectively human beings took for granted what an extraordinary accomplishment it is to be able to gather massive amounts of people in a space for an experience of almost transcendent out-of-body fervor, right? I mean, that's describing the best sports fandom live, viewing experiences. And you just took them for granted, right? I mean, it was just something that was, you never thought something would come along that would make it impossible to have those experiences and have those gatherings. And so, Stern felt, in retrospect, it feels prophetic what he's describing there, and precisely what we've lost, right? And so in that sense, sports will be, fingers crossed, when there's a vaccine or a sufficient treatment, or, when things progress with the virus to make it possible, sports will be the thing that confirms that we're back to normal. Sports will be the thing that is a kind of declaration where we've kind of planted a flag on the corpse of COVID, hopefully, and saying we overruled it, or that's the wrong phrase, but
we shall overcome the PBS.
Yeah, right. But and the reason, so to go back to the other part of your question, which is why is it that this is so important for media and advertisers as well, another big argument throughout the book is that sports is the last live cultural phenomenon that we all take part in. Especially in the realm of television, right? I mean, it used to be the case up until the late 90s and even early 2000s, you could make the case, that when something aired on TV, everybody was having that cultural experience at the same time together, right? It was, it predates me, but it's J.R. Ewing getting shot on Dallas and people watching that. It's the figures on the last episode of Seinfeld, or the last episode of MASH, are extraordinary, right? And even the regular viewership figures were extraordinary, not even for the big final episodes. Very few other things do that. Like, people are consuming culture at their own pace. Some people still watch Game of Thrones on Sunday night, but plenty of other people are just starting it now or just finishing it. So we're kind of all in different, cultural moments in terms of time and in terms of synchronizing our time experience. And so sports is the thing that provides us with that synchronicity, and certainly massive synchronicity, which is missed in this moment of pandemic. So I think just to wrap it up there, asking about whether or not people will come back to it, I think they will. I mean, I think that people, as soon as there's a sense of it is safe to attend massive sporting events again, people will do it, because the craving for that energy, for that electricity, that social electricity, is powerful, and I don't think it's going away.
I don't either. I mean, I just look back. I mean, in April, it looks just ridiculous now, and I like kind of highlighting the absurdity of Clemson head coach in football, Dabo Swinney, saying that it's like he kind of embodies this sort of evangelical like optimism for optimism's sake, saying that we're going to pack. I have no doubt we're going to pack Death Valley, 80,000 fans screaming. It's the same guy in June that was like trying to give a speech about how people need the whole America love it or leave it, not realizing that and quoting Dr. King, not realizing that while King was alive, people told him to love it or leave it every single day. And it would be like akin to saying the King back in the 60s. Oh, what do you mean? Like Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass sacrificed and Lincoln, ended slavery. So what are you complaining about? So there's always that impulse. It just amazes me how he's still able to, recruit like that and just get away with saying things like that. But it does show you that, I think that there's certain people like him that are fans that even without a vaccine and when it's not safe, I'm going to be going on Friday to visit my family in Jacksonville, Florida with some restrictions, but which is now the hotbed nationally. And it's because early on they, it's just like idea that people, I'm not going to wear a mask because the government told me so, right? I'm just going to have this sort of take this ultra individualistic stand. And while in other parts that were, like New York City area that was being the hotbed early on, it kind of flattened the curve a little bit. It's like now Florida, Texas, these places by no accident are the hotbeds. And it's exactly that kind of just sort of fatalistic belief that, God's favor will protect me or something like that. And so that'll be, so yeah, there's no doubt that it's going to come back. But I think that one thing I wanted to kind of ask you about, just building on that, is that there's so much, like you see Jerry Jones and the way he kind of reacted to like the Colin Kaepernick taking knee stuff. And we see some of the owners who maybe weren't as vocal clearly felt about that. But the battleground that will be this, who has authority to define the cultural space on the field and what that means. I saw Bill O'Reilly's back, believe it or not, and giving some rant here now on his YouTube channel about how, Roger Goodell's got to come out, be a strong man, basically ban any politics, on NFL Sundays, and say that maybe there's some Wednesday press conference they can have to talk about whatever. But the idea, and just with like really strict punishments. But what he doesn't realize is there's been a sea change. Guys, like, this is an existential thing. Families, their families are on the line.
You never want to underestimate the greed of sports franchise ownership and the leagues and stuff to plow through labor, even as it gets sick with the virus and stuff. So I think that there's a possibility of that. With regard to how players are able to band together and exercise greater amounts of activism, I also would not underestimate the potential there. I think, different leagues have different norms around the relationship between ownership and labor. And I think the NBA versus the NFL is a great example of that, right? I think there has been a sense in the NBA that it's much more of a players run league. The ownership is much more anonymous relative to the NFL. The NFL, there's a real way in which those owners like to be up in the boxes and like to really sort of have this sort of commanding authority type image that they strike. And the players are seen as interchangeable parts, right? Just spares,
Well, part of the helmet's part of that, don't you think? Like in football, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. as it may have been Stern who told me this, but someone did that. Because NBA players more or less play in their pajamas, it's easier to get to know them. It's we see their faces, we see their expressions, we see their styles, we see their individuality, and there's much less individuality that the NFL allows for all kinds of reasons. The norms of the sport, the cultures, things like that. So I think whether or not you'll see pushback from player labor as safety and health deteriorates, which I think it will. I am really hoping I'm wrong on this, but I don't think we will see team sports at the professional or collegiate level played until there's a vaccine. I think they're going to try. They're obviously going to try. The way in which players push back against that is interesting. They might be able to mount some campaign that gives them more leverage in terms of the protocols of safety. But these leagues, it's still, you can try to make it as safe as humanly possible, but they're still crashing into each other. And there's still, I think if someone's infected, a lot of people are going to get infected, it seems like.
Yeah, you hit on something that's just, really important. The whole idea of making football safer is embedded with contradictions. Because you have the whole thing to try to take on the concussion issue. Well, now you're seeing more guys' knees get knocked, just taken out, and then guys are hitting lower and learning. So it's there's, it's a combat sport, and you look back at the Roman Colosseum and gladiators and whatnot, and we're not hauling guys off, dead on stretchers necessarily. At least, Darryl Stingley, would maybe have something to say about that. Paralyzed, but it's still like, you're not going to fundamentally, you can't, as long as that's still part of it, it's still part of it. But I would say that, I guess, just before move on, is that with players, I think that one thing Kaepernick did, and what he, in little legacies of it, is like the paradigm shift, from repudiation of Jordan's, just play the game mantra, of meaning play the game being just like a way of saying, don't say anything, right, that could potentially offend anybody, just build a brand. But players are realizing that even that's a fake brand, and the authenticity and being real is actually, not just like the right thing socially, but that, is even better for their brand in a lot of cases, ironically. But you're seeing a loss of fear that I think is manifesting itself now with the pandemic, and then there's strength in numbers, and the sense that the more NFL ownership tries to crack down, the more that's going to build up a sense of like kind of indignation, I think.
I think just to jump in on, I think you're absolutely right. Kaepernick was a watershed figure in the history of sports activism, obviously. And I think that the broader way in which there's player activism right now, I really think is heavily related to media change, right? It's not that there has suddenly become, in the last 5 years, it's not like there's suddenly become more injustices that players of color, or just Americans of color, experience relative to 10 or 15, 20, 100 years ago. What has changed has been the ability for players to articulate through their own media channels a pushback against the forces of racism and the forces of injustice that they wouldn't have had in the heyday of Jordan, right?
Well, they're able to bypass the gatekeepers right now. They kind of, right, a little bit. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. And so that is that's extraordinary, and that is a huge change in terms of what they've been able to do relative to previous, more apolitical generations.
No, yeah, there's no doubt about it. And so we'll see how that evolves here. So you often hear about, to get back to this, how profitable, and you write about this in the book, college football, basketball, college sports are in general, and that it ties into questions of student athlete labor exploitation, which are as relevant now as ever with the push to make sure to save college football. But you point out in the book how out of like 340 Division I collegiate athletic departments, only 23 of them actually operate in the black. And it's usually like football. They get the big booster donations and whatnot, and they come in, and in some ways, I don't know how you feel about this, but I mean, I like as a teacher and educator myself. In a perfect world, I always hear stuff like, "Oh, players are so overpaid. Like they should pay teachers more." I'm like, "Oh, I agree, but if players get paid less, the owners are just going to keep that money in their pocket. It's not going to go to me." So if we could find a way to make that work, and then that'd be fine. But in terms of college, you have this whole the student athletes now, and they're. And when you look at those numbers, 340, 23 are profitable. So many of these boosters, are only donating to like football or men's basketball. They're earmarking that, right? So it's not like they're just giving a check to the school and saying, "Hey, they'll spend it on, financing another book for, Professor Serazio or, other academics," right? It's earmarked. And, so how is it that dynamic sustains itself where only 23 athletic departments are operating in the black? And so many, I guess, the men's and women's like Olympic sports primarily, they're not making money, but even as you point out, that even it's not even college football, loses money at a lot of schools. So how does it sustain itself despite those numbers that kind of speak for themselves?
Yeah. Well, it doesn't. I mean, it goes back to the fundamental tension between the cultural power and the sort of social allure of what sports provide us and their actual financial realities of what they extract from us, right? And so culture and economics are in tension there. I think that even though very few college athletic programs operate in the black, I think that there is such inertia around and pride around those programs, so that even if they're money losers, they are emotional winners, mm-hmm. and they're social and cultural winners for these programs. They give many of these universities identity, and they bring together community, and those things have value. Like I definitely believe deeply in those things. But if you actually think about, just sort of the sort of pure, are you selling enough tickets? Are you selling enough merchandise relative to the cost of running some of these programs? And again, I don't claim to be an economist, but my understanding of economic expertise on this is that it doesn't add up.
Yeah, and basically it's the big time boosters at these schools that fill in the gaps, and ultimately that they do get some back end windfall too. What studies have shown that I've found, I'm not sure if you've seen this, where the schools that win like the college football national championship or win the national championship or make it to the Final Four in March Madness see an upsurge in applications, and we all know that the application fees that come with that bring in a lot of money. So while they might be in the literal sense, like you say, in terms of just
And that's a great point. And that's a great point. And what that actually speaks to is, you say like, how is it sustainable? Well, then that becomes a gambling thing, right? It becomes a thing of like, look, if we can somehow win, March Madness, we're going to see an increase and we will get a financial windfall from that because, donations are going to go up for alums and more applicants are going to come in the front door. But only one university gets to win that prize, right? It's a gamble, right? There's still a whole lot of places that don't take home the title, and therefore they're not going to take home that windfall. And so all these other places are gambling on that hope of that potential financial windfall. Yeah.
No doubt. So look, we mentioned earlier San Diego, to get back kind of the book and the stadium examples, and you bring up the particularly outrageous example of what in Minnesota, which is a stark contrast to like how the stadium thing played out in San Diego. And I think it's interesting now with the George Floyd murder that happened there in Minneapolis. The call, a lot of there's a strong activist community there. In Minneapolis is pushing the city on all sorts of budget issues, and obviously the defund police thing kind of came from out of Minneapolis. And then we look at how much money just has been hemorrhaged from their city coffers, and you look at the social problems that exist that are tied into policing and all of the other things there. And really, if you're a progressive activist on the left or whatever wherever you fit in that spectrum, and you're trying to affect change, you're almost like committing malpractice in a sense of not fully understand. And, how, and I think sometimes it's just this reflexively negative, like we hate sports mentality. It makes it where you kind of, your voice is immediately just kind of tuned out instead of taking the nuanced approach about, sports being important, but also being able to push back on stuff like US Bank Stadium. So how were maybe Ziggy Wilf and the Minnesota Vikings and Roger Goodell able to push through this just massive palace essentially there in Minneapolis? What kind of dynamics maybe I'm not sure how much you study that in terms of juxtaposing how it worked there in contrast to, how in San Diego, the community said, no, you're not going to do this to us. And, they paid the price, but nonetheless, they didn't mortgage out their whole fiscal future either.
Yeah. No, I think, the specifics of the Minnesota, financing of that stadium and the public debate there around that, I don't know as well as I know the San Diego one. But the fact that they were successful was in keeping with what happens most of the time when franchises and ownership want taxpayers to pony up money, and that is extortion, right? It's a mafia tactic. It's a mafia tactic, right? It's like it would be a shame. We know you love these. You love the Vikings. It would be a real shame if something happened to them, and they got swept out of town or something. I think that the leagues and ownership are always operating at an advantage because there's other cities that would be willing to pony up the money for that stadium. Vegas will pay for a stadium if Oakland isn't going to. LA, Kroenke is going to, I think, mostly privately finance that, but St. Louis, was abandoned. There's been lots of cities that have been abandoned in this regard. And I think that the pushback has to come from the fact that these owners are rich, pay for it yourself. It's part of a broader problem of economic power in the United States being heavily concentrated in a small minority of individuals and being able to wield that power in all kinds of ways. And so I think that's the pushback here in San Diego and the pushback in a lot of places needs to be you're a billionaire owner, you pay for it yourself.
No, exactly. The whole irony of all the
money on schools, we got to spend our money on housing, other priorities that are much more publicly valuable than a cushy new stadium.
Right. I mean, and these are the same people that fund NGOs and think tanks that constantly deride the welfare state, constantly deride the notion that it's breeding quote welfare moms and these insidious caricatures they spit out of of your government dependency and whatnot. When if you work on the front lines of this and you deal with the kind of issues I've dealt with games in high school football where kids have played their last high school football game who've grown up in the projects in Jacksonville or Jersey City and have just, don't see a life trajectory really going beyond maybe 25 years really. And it's that lack of imagination is not just an individual failing. That lack of imagination is systemically ingrained in sort of the class stratification you highlight that, how, fragmented we are as a society, but really how stratified we are by class and how that kind of affects our consciousness. And we so often just individualize every problem. And it's just, these same people are deriding all that are then going back and taking bigger amounts of corporate welfare than anybody, any of those people combined. So I think that needs to be a rhetorical point that's hammered home relentlessly. But real quick, just I know you mentioned, and I just before I forget, you mentioned the experience with the Chargers and even if, I think it was your grandfather's funeral or whatever, and the hat there and all that, and kind of how that serves as memory and how that kind of ties to so many people's memories are rooted in that, and we've sort of hit on that in the symbolism of that, but maybe you could talk about that, but also just sort of how you and other people you've known in San Diego sort of that relationship with the Chargers, is it one that now that's you want them to fail? Is it one now that it's people revel in seeing the almost empty, MLS stadium they were playing in? Or are there some people that are still it's still the power of the symbolism is still enough to keep them, attached? I mean, I'm just kind of curious, given the power that maybe that something that's simple as a hat can have, if that move is so, and the Spanos and everything's disgusting about what they do, is what would you think the breakdown is? Just, totally unscientifically, I understand, sure. But in terms of how people feel about that.
Yeah, well, I think that my sense, completely anecdotally, is that the vast majority of San Diegans have washed their hands of in some cases not just the Chargers but NFL football as a whole. Mm-hmm. Certainly in my own family, extended family, most of the Chargers fans, most of my relatives have given up on them. And I've, I wonder why I haven't also washed my hands of them as well. I think part of it is, so I live in Boston these days, and I think if there was a less loathsome local NFL franchise that I could get behind locally, I would probably do so. But the Patriots are not that franchise. No, I think, I think part of the reason why people are very justifiably happy to see the empty state, the empty Galaxy Stadium in Carson, and very happy to see the Chargers fail is because, for those who love the team so much, it was an act of betrayal. It was robbing us, to go back to what we started with, it was robbing us of identity and community. Mm-hmm. And so, heck yeah, I'm still a Chargers fan, but I want to see that stadium empty. I want to see if that new one too, right? Yeah, and I want to see the new Inglewood stadium that they're renting from Kroenke. I want to see that thing totally empty. It's a very weird ambivalence to feel like that. It's a very weird. I'm still holding on to the hope that they'll come back to San Diego. I think that's delusional. Mm-hmm. But what is sports fandom if not being delusional, right?
Exactly.
And you say that as a Jaguars fan, right?
Man. Yeah.
But there's something in that delusion that is necessary. And to go back to this notion of my grandfather being buried with his San Diego Chargers hat. There was a very fascinating experiment that a couple of social psychologists ran under the field of what's known as terror management theory, terror management theory is basically how do people deal with the fact that we're all going to die? Like, how do we, like, if human beings, rationally know that like all of us are going to die someday, how do we cope with that?
Yeah.
And so in this experiment, they prompted people to think about that, think about their own death, and then to like fill out some survey questions about how likely their team was going to win it all the next season, right? And what they found was the more prompted you were to think about death, the more likely you believed that your team was going to win it all. And so the theory here is that one of the things sports teams provide us with as religious totems is they give us something where we feel like we're going to live on past our own death, right? If you're a Yankees fan, you know that you're going to die, but you know that the Yankees, this thing that you've attached yourself to, will still be around after you're gone. And that is really necessary, and that is really valuable for human beings. And I think that that's part of what drives that irrational logic of our attachment to these teams, and maybe even why I haven't given up on the. I mean, if the Chargers had, on some level, if the Chargers had scrapped the franchise name, and when they moved up to LA, I would be so done with them. I'm not going to root for the LA Sharks or whatever.
Yeah, just a totally vacuous, like, a meaning and emotional attachment there, right?
Yeah, I mean, there was no attachment there, but they kept the team, they kept the logo, they kept, the identity to some degree. And so, I joke, I've spent too much of my life being disappointed by the Chargers to quit now.
Well, you can pull for Justin Jackson, a guy that was at Northwestern University, was very got involved heavily with activism. They had the whole move to unionize like college athletes for the first time, and he was actually out canvassing for Bernie Sanders and stuff in Nevada earlier on this year. Like the idea of an NFL player doing that's pretty remarkable. But I doubt if he was a quarterback of a franchise, they would be so just kind of like, whatever, do your own thing. But nonetheless, silver linings. But anyways, the kind of I wanted to just to move on here. I mean, I'll just say, can you elaborate on, in your book, you talked about Phil Knight a lot and just like the development of Nike and like kind of like in terms of marketing, advertising, cultural power that it holds. He realized the thing you quote him saying is that he realized that he wasn't even in the shoe business. He was in the entertainment business, and the keyword entertainment, and how does that quote from Knight and sort of help us understand, like maybe like looking at Air Jordans as an example, they're like practical, material, tangible value versus the symbolic value that we perceive them as possessing. And is it like a result of is it just cultural interpolation where we're just like, as growing up, we're just bombarded with it? I mean, I just think of like dealing with a lot of kids I deal with, and they're, most struggling and how they, kids can be so brutal to each other. Like, if you don't have this, or you got something that's like, not fresh or not what it's supposed to be. It's like people that are already fighting for scraps that are like, these people are sitting back, they don't know. I mean, they're kids, but it's just like, it's so tragic. And it's like, I can't help but think that's almost the intended effect almost, is to create that like scarcity, that just like symbolic, almost fetishizing of that logo, and, knowing that all well, kind of what all comes with that. And, but what does it say about just sort of like the power of the gods of mass consumerism, and what maybe can we do as people and to kind of to push back in a way that's not like, being like criticizing people, low income people, like, oh, you're wearing, shoes that are made in a sweatshop. Someone who's like, it's sort of like you think of like the bougie, like Whole Foods consumer, like looking down at like people for, not voting with their wallet, who are already barely living paycheck to paycheck for like shopping at Walmart. So you want to like avoid that kind of thing, because that's obviously not going to sit well or connect well with like working class people that are already really struggling. But nonetheless, recognizing, that, these people like that, there's just something fundamentally wrong with that. And I was just kind of curious for your thoughts.
Well, what Phil Knight recognized in Nike is what any successful brand comes to realize, which is that the brand is not about the product itself. It's about the imaginary world that's built upon it. And all branding is an act of collective consensual delusion, right? Because like, why is it that the Nike sneakers why is it the Air Jordans cost $150 or whatever they cost? They cost probably more than that. It's been a while since I've shopped even for Air Jordans.
Especially with the whole vintage sneaker market and stuff.
Yeah. why do they cost that amount? And it's like, or for that matter, any athletic sneaker that's endorsed by, Tom Brady endorsing Under Armour or Steph Curry or whatever.
Yeah.
And, the argument that is made to the consumer is that if you buy these shoes, you will be able to play sports like the athlete that we've signed to endorse. And that's the fundamental underpinning, right? And that is completely delusional, like entirely delusional, right? And yet the exact same pair of sneakers could be manufactured and created for a fraction of the $150 cost. But if they don't have the logo on them, they're not worth the same amount in terms of their sort of use value. And so that is like really delusional, and that is really crazy. And I think that that's one of the things that Phil Knight recognized and capitalized and exploited, that we are far more attracted to the imaginary cultural value of a product as opposed to its tangible real value.
Right.
And so, the more that we try to remind ourselves of that, how do we overcome that? I mean, we're so deep in commercial culture that I don't even know how you find your way out of it. But it's a very understandable attachment, very understandable attraction in that regard.
Yeah, and I should. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's totally delusional at the same time, even as it is understandable.
Yeah, so I mean, I should have read this quote before I kicked it over to you, but you wrote in the book that we think not of the exploited garment worker in Dhaka when interacting with the swoosh or Chicago Bulls logo that she sewed on, but rather of the seductive wonderment and social power those icons supposedly offer us in the developed postmodern world. So you already did. I was going to ask you about the context. You already did provide the context, but I just wanted to at least provide the listeners and viewers kind of like where that was coming from a little bit. So when we talk about the financial irrationality, so let's transition real quick. I'll leave this one kind of open-ended, but just sort of, you've kind of done it already, the sports totem, but in the context of Emil Durkheim, sort of, and like how Durkheim's work helped you kind of make the connection between the early sociology pioneer that he was, and like between fandom and both the individual and social construction of identity. I think we've hit on a lot of it, but if there's anything specific, kind of like what you learned from doing your research in Durkheim and then making the connections that you think is valuable, and I'd love to hear it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think again, Durkheim didn't write about sports himself. He wrote about religion, but I think his insights are really powerful in understanding what it is that religion provides for people. And it's a sense of community. It's a sense of sort of existential affirmation that, you're connected to others in a world that very much tries to disconnect us from others. And so I think that's, all of that describes similarly what we get out of sports, and the fact that the fact that the parallels of sports and religion are so frequent, right? In sports, we use the language of faith. We say things like, you got to believe, right? Sports is about trying to achieve kind of perfection of the body, and religion is about achieving some sort of perfection of the soul or perfection of the mind, depending on which tradition. So there's I think just all kinds of interesting parallels, and they've been true also throughout history. I mean, everything from indigenous civilizations in the Native American era of Central and South America, having parallels to the muscular Christianity of the Victorian era. So there's been parallels that have been made explicit throughout history as well. And I think especially as people identify as less religious in the US. So the latest figures suggest that about maybe 50 or 60 million Americans are what they call religiously unaffiliated. They don't formally identify with any faith tradition. They still need the stuff that religion provided. And I don't have any research on this, but I mean, I have a conjecture, which is that sports is satisfying, I think, a lot of the urges that religion might have provided them if that had been the means that they got out of it. So,
building on what you just said, it'd be a good time to go ahead and take a look at a clip from like the Buffalo Bills, sort of a compilation of just tailgating scene outside their stadium in Orchard Park, New York, out in Norton, which is a suburb of Buffalo, right outside Buffalo. And just the debauchery, the just sort of the sacrificing of their bodies, like the burning of Brady jerseys in effigy. This clip won't have the disgusting Kaepernick thing. We're back, I think, in 2016. They had like a tackle, like the Muslim thing, where like they had a dummy of Kaepernick caricature up. So there's a lot of, I mean, I don't want to hardly make it seem like I'm just like picking on Buffalo, although quite frankly, they kind of have a pretty, when you look across the league, I can't find anything, more intense and just, and I think, it's a deindustrialized area. So many of the jobs, you look at have been exported. You have just, the opioid epidemic has ravaged the area. You have people that have moved and left, and the bills, like really, and almost like it's like almost like a communal display of like their own, like kind of like maybe self-loathing in some ways. But let's go ahead and take a look at the clip, and then we'll react on the back end.
Yeah, I mean, so the Bills Mafia tradition is one of the more amusing manifestations of fan subculture that you've seen. With a lot of teams have developed these kind of wacky fan subcultures. I think about like the Cleveland Browns and like the guys wearing like the dog masks, and there's other patterns of that. Like I remember when the Heat were really successful, they would have like the all whiteout crowd or whatever in Miami, the wearing white clothes or whatever, and this one, I think, speaks to, not to get too esoteric and scholarly, but there's a notion that the theorist Mikhail Bakhtin came up with, which is basically called the carnivalesque. And his idea was that within society, there are certain spaces and times that have to be reserved for things being sort of upside down. And what he described as the carnival, right, which is kind of the tradition of historically of kind of pre-Lenten tradition of going crazy, Fat Tuesday.
Kind of like Mardi Gras in New Orleans, like contemporarily, right? Yeah.
So all societies have to carve out some of these spaces where rules do not apply, people can sort of be an uninhibited version of themselves. And I think that's what you see with Bill's Mafia to some degree, right? And it becomes, I think that part of the reason why Bill's Mafia will develop is precisely because the team has been bad for so long, right? It's more necessary to want to have something to look forward to attend these games, because the actual product in the field is not going to be that interesting. But the solidarity is. Solidarity will be meaningful. Like those wacky stunts that you saw in the video are the things that are memorable when the experience on the field of play isn't. And so, I think that's a factor, and there is a way in which within fan subcultures, you mentioned before, the fact that this is kind of a Rust Belt city. It's a deindustrialized or sort of post-industrial, in a post-industrial moment. It's a city that has, I think, identified itself very much with, with blue collar work historically. And a lot of those teams in those cities and those fans of those teams in those cities take a kind of sadomasochistic pride in attending games where the weather is crummy and, they see that reflected in their own experiences, right? You're going to tough it out. And there are other cities where that's not the case. Like there's no, you don't see that in Phoenix. You don't see that in San Diego. You don't see it in Jacksonville, right? The fans, there's definitely stronger, more passionate fan allegiances in northern and eastern cities in the U.S. relative to other parts of the country. And there's all kinds of reasons for that. But I think what with Bills Mafia, the reason why that came about was certainly, I think, due in part to the team being really bad and fans needing to have a reason to get excited about games, Yeah.
You kind of referenced it earlier too, and then before we're kind of close out here in a second, but I really wanted to mention and bring up like the way in which just on, with Bills Mafia in general, how the anonymity sort of like being in a crowd and fanhood sort of ties into that, like what notion of like, needing that space to let loose, to be uninhibited. And because I even think back to like, being a teenager and even like times in college at games and just like, screaming stuff at like, some player or whatever, or just like some other fan and getting into some like heated thing with some stranger adult, over like who knows what. And I'm just like, I think afterwards, like what was I doing? Like, where did that even come from? Like, and like, I mean, maybe, I don't know, in terms of the research you just sort of cited, I mean, is that just like what is it about, like, maybe just, us as humans where, I mean, it's not everybody. I mean, some people are very just modest and maybe they find other means of like kind of putting that into, you could say, more productive and, into kind of more productive forms of energy. But, that it's sort of, we do sort of seem to have like sort of a building tendency and like a destruction tendency in humanity where people like that sort of are working in concert where, we have amazing creative capacity, but we also have this like propensity to kind of like enjoy it, that seeing something kind of becoming, like caught on fire. You see all the fireworks going off in cities and stuff now during the pandemic. I mean, I don't know if that's part of it, but I mean, I don't know.
It's needing an outlet, right? It's, and this being, Bills Mafia, just to take that example still, is the space and the outlet that's been carved out for that type of behavior that human beings, feel compelled to perform. And, I think that that's something that is necessary. It's a way of channeling that energy. It's a way of channeling that fervor. And it's a safe, I mean, again, I think as you put it earlier, it could be a fan tradition that was initiated by the Chiropractors Association of Buffalo. So It's not entirely safe, but it's like relatively safe. It's like relatively harmless, like, goofballs jumping on tables that crack in half. Like it's a relative to other things that human beings can do.
Minus the whole catching on fire part,
It simulates a mostly safe destructive impulse that is satisfying and perhaps necessary too. And so I think that that's probably where that impulse comes from as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, just to go ahead and close out, there's a couple of quotes I just want to hit on and then I'll pitch it to you and then we'll wrap up. But Rupert Murdoch, the News Corporation, you write in the book and quote, who also owns Fox News, talked about sport absolutely overpowers film and everything else in the entertainment genre. And part of the evidence you cite for that is that out of like the 25 highest rated broadcasts in American history, that 22 have been sporting events, and on average, sports related newspaper stories online out-hit all other subjects combined. So again, it gets back to kind of what I sort of started with, the idea that, whether or not people think sports are a good thing, or people that, have this idea that it's this like hopelessly kind of reactionary backwards tendency, to ignore them is to just fundamentally remain ignorant to a major force that drives not just American culture, but globally, especially with like the global version of football, not American football, and its power in society. And Rupert Murdoch, just ruthless billionaire, understands that, very, very well. And it's, you see that in the investments they've made. And I'm just sort of wondering, where Fox, CBS, NBC, ABC, would be, and if they would really even be viable anymore if it weren't for sports, given like that the ESPN CEO, you quote Michael Eisner, is joking that, Disney would not exist without ESPN. And just let that sink in for a minute, because for so many folks that don't engage in sport and think that it's sort of just like a subculture, that's striking. And Disney World, Disneyland, that just the prominence of Disney and just like our just cultural media apparatus we have. So anything you want to close on in terms of just what you learned from doing your research and writing the book, and that you think is important, maybe that we haven't hit on, and just about the power of sports.
No, I mean, and you mentioned the, the historic 22 of the top 25 watched broadcasts in U.S. history. Most of those are Super Bowls. But even if you take a step down from the Super Bowl level, at this point every year when the annual kind of Nielsen ratings for most watched shows in a given year come out, at this point, the last several years, last 4 or 5 years that I've tracked it, it's right around about 90 of the top 100 programs on television are sporting events, are games, so the way in which sports is not a subculture, it's the last mass culture, is precisely, I think, what I was trying to explore with this notion of the power of sports in the book. I think just to sort of wrap it up and sort of tie together, I think a lot of what we talked about so far, I keep going back to this tension between the cultural side of things and the economic side of things, right? The fact, what is the purpose of sports? And you can answer that in two ways. You can say the purpose of sports, on one hand, if you're reading it optimistically, you can say it's about bringing together massive amounts of people who are often from very different backgrounds to coalesce around an object of adoration or an experience of playing the sport where you are so deeply steeped in the moment of that very few other things in this world can compare, for providing you with your identity, providing you with your friendships, providing you sustaining relationships. That's the purpose of sport, absolutely, and I believe deeply in that, and that's valuable, and I cheer that on. The other purpose of sport could be that it is it's an institution where greedy, exploitative economics define it. It is historically been especially wrapped up in pathologies of gender. I mean, we haven't talked a lot about that at this point, but it's sort of way in which sport is a space carved out historically for men, to the detriment of the experience of women's sports, and the way that sport has been wielded in gender politics, I think is deeply troubling, and sports sends a lot of messages that are, I think, very problematic. And so, I look at sports as a fan weighted by that ambivalence. I love how sports can bring us together. I treasure that. I think it provides all kinds of vehicles for inspiration, but I think it's naive to only see that side of the coin. And I think that just as equally, we have to grapple with all of the less inspiring and less salutary aspects of sports. I think that's sort of what the book tries to do.
Yeah. All right. Great. So I really want to thank you for your time. I mean, there's so much to get into, and you highlight the sort of omission of gender, and it's something that I feel like needs to definitely needs to be hit on more, because you're definitely right about it sort of being this space of really in the early American context, even football's emergence is a breeding ground for like a sort of a masculine warrior class in a lot of ways. To sort of like in fear, with the fear being that this is like creeping feminization of the more material wealth that's sort of accumulated in a society, that like the less tough we become, right? And then there's all sorts of problematic stuff embedded in that, and so maybe we could with the the later parts of the book at some other time after we get this released, come back and kind of tackle gender more at some point, and the other aspects of commercialization in more specific detail, as opposed to just kind of like the pandemic and sort of the social justice kind of like displays, and also just more contemporary issues we've discussed today. So anyways, appreciate the time. I really can't thank you enough, and stay safe and all the best. All right.
Thank you very much, Nathaniel. I hugely appreciate your thoughtful conversation and really thoughtful questions. It's a delight to be able to chat with you. And I also wish you the best of health. I hope that Jersey City schools open okay. And I hope that, I hope that the next time we're able to convene and connect, things are in an even more hopeful place overall.